Welcome. I'm going to do something now that my graduate professors and some colleagues will probably shit a brick about, but I want to present a very brief primer on the field of academics called literary theory or literary criticism. Now, for most of you who are not English or comparative literature majors, this study might seem unnecessary, and you could have probably gone through life without even knowing, much less caring about such terms as difference, the subaltern, or the ideal I. But I'm going to do it anyways, because it is significant when it comes down to analyzing the story. But more significantly, it is a critical thinking skill that allows you to shatter hegemony in all forms of society, to deconstruct the signs and systems of the world as you know it, so you can better empower yourself through knowledge from the illusory grips of authority and oppression. Now, most professors consider literary theory in a very elitist way, claiming that it takes decades of study and research to truly get it. And I agree. My whole graduate years was spent reading theory. It's extremely heady stuff, and I'm not here to convert you or scare you off, but to give you a historical perspective on this part of academia so that sometime in the far future you might take an interest in these quite revolutionary ideas. Let me begin by saying that you have already done a form of literary theory in the class with your first discussion question I gave you. When I asked what were your favorite stories from childhood that had an impact on your upbringing and adult perspective, that was literary criticism. It comes from a theory called reader's response, and theorists like Wolfgang Iser and Stanley Fish justify that analysis of the text because of how the literary work should be explained in a truly subjective, performative manner. You read it, you remember it, and so much that it must reflect your personal viewpoint and identity. Now, I'm a novice of reader's response. I've read Wolfgang Iser, in German in fact, but the theory wasn't my specialty. I do admire its procedure, and it comes from a long line of literary theories that emerged within the 20th century, and so it's a good way to start off this discussion. Okay, way back when, in the 19th century, the way of understanding a story was through the study of the author's biography. This is called biographical criticism. And there's a form of theory that's still popular today. We like to read about people's lives, their memoirs, famous people who wrote these wonderful books that we treasure. It fascinates us. In fact, there's a new book out, it just came out last month, about Margaret Wise Brown, the woman who wrote Goodnight Moon, which revealed her bisexuality, but more intriguing was her indifference toward children. She didn't like kids, and yet her most famous work is on every child's bookshelf. Again, fascinating stuff. And still, the argument against biographical criticism as a legitimate literary theory is that we'll never truly know the author's intent when she composed the text. Nor should we. We don't need to know Coleridge's opiate experience to truly comprehend Kubla Khan, for instance, or that Charlie Perkins Gilman was subjected to a rest cure which inspired her work The Yellow Wallpaper. Again, interesting, but doesn't impact my reading of the story. And so, by the beginning of the 20th century, biographical criticism was pretty much discarded in the field of literature to make way of a new set of theories based on not the author's experience, but on the reader's interpretation. No longer is the author relevant to his creation, the text. In fact, like Nietzsche in the past, Roland Barthes declared the author is dead. This allows the text to be freed from the author's intent and make it so-called public domain. That means we, as readers, consumers of the stories, can do whatever we wish, sans plagiarism or profit. So came, by way of the Russians, a new type of interpretation called formalism, which simply and only looks at the form of the story, its language, its signs, its ingredients to understand its meaning. And we don't need the author around to tell us anything else. And incidentally, this is a form of close reading, and it includes other theories like new criticism. But it actually stems from biblical studies called hermeneutics. This is what monks do. They comb through the verses of the Old Testament to understand meaning without trying to understand God's intent. From formalism emerged another theory, one with more staying power and expanded throughout the human sciences, called structuralism. Still looking only at the text, the structuralists were less interested in the technique of language and literature, linguistics, and more into the social and cultural impact and reflection of the language and literature, its semiotics, according to Ferdinand de Saussure. the structure of the story. From there, theorists like Vladimir Pop would notice patterns in the children's stories where the young hero would take on a journey and overcome obstacles or an ogre in order to be rewarded at the end. Northrop Frye would call these patterns archetypes. Then Claude Levi-Strauss would not only look at how the literature is played out linearly, reading word after word for meaning, but it's how it's passed up and down through generations and even boundaries. Levi-Strauss noticed that works of literature and even science have behaved similarly in different countries. For instance, he called it the raw and the cooked, how people from diverse backgrounds like cooked meat instead of raw meat. How's this seen in literature? Well, a baby floating down a river in a basket in the Hebrew story of Moses is echoed in the Japanese Momotaro. Just instead of a basket, there's a peach. Is this coincidence? Or does the structure of the myth help us understand the cultural influences and patterns? From this, Levi-Strauss deduced what he called binary oppositions, that we view the world in binaries, good, bad, right, wrong, male, female, master, slave, rich, poor. And not only do these binaries need each other, the master is nothing without the slave to oppress, but one side of the binary, the good, the right, the male, master, rich side, is favored over the other side, the bad, the wrong, female, slave, poor side. I'll explain this again using Socratic dialectics and Taoism in a later lesson, but the useful thing about these binaries is that you can see them in every story and even societal structures. We want to be good instead of bad. We want to be right instead of wrong. These are the structures of society. The problematic part of these binaries, however, is that they're being used to establish boundaries within societies to the extent of establishing power. So that in a patriarchal society, the males oppress the females. In a capitalistic society, the rich is dominant over the poor. And this is where post-structuralism comes in. By the 1960s, when the free speech movement was happening in Berkeley, the French had their own civil rights revolution. And of that came a short essay called Structure, Sign, and Play by a little-known young French scholar named Jacques Derrida. And he brought with this essay a method of literally overturning the structure, called deconstruction. Believing that the foundation or center was not there, he suggested that the structure, these binaries, are shifting, what he calls slippage. And his way of thinking freed the reader and the text to pay attention to that other side. And there grew a whole generation of literary theories to challenge the so-called true meaning of the text and societal control itself. For most post-structuralism, we get feminism, and gender studies, hearing the voices of women for a change, as well as those in the LGBTQ community. We get the return of Marxist thought. Although the proletariat revolution never occurred, we're still fighting against corrupt capitalism even today. We get post-colonialism, letting the others, those who've been assimilated by the dominant language, speak in their own language. And we get neo-historicism, breaking away from that grand narrative of history into observing these tiny fractures of histories of everyday people. Again, this is simply by reading the text do we truly understand the story. And such modern theories allow us to have a multitude of different perspectives and interpretation on a single story. No one interpretation is incorrect. You can misread a story though, but you can't misinterpret a story, as long as you can support it, your interpretation by the text itself.